Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this evening for the Garden to Table series, the Stir Fry Garden. I am Elizabeth Brent from the Family Consumer Science Extension Agent for UT Extension, Washington County. And with me this evening is Adam Watson. He'll introduce himself here in a minute. But just some housekeeping for you all. We are recording this session, and it will be shared on YouTube. So if you don't want to be seen, please make sure that your cameras are turned off. If you don't know how to, we can be able to do that here for you. But please be sure your microphones are on mute. Um, we will be taking questions kind of throughout the presentation. So if you happen to have any questions, just feel free to put those in the chat box and we will answer them at the end of each of the presentations. And then, like I said, the session will be recorded and shared on YouTube. So if you do not want to be seen, please turn off your cameras. And then also, the information within this class is for educational purposes only. Reference to commercial products or trade names doesn't imply endorsement by UT Extension. And I think one person has their hand up and they wanted their video off. But I am going to hand it over to Adam Watson.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, my name is Adam Watson. I'm an agriculture agent with the Washington County uh, Extension Office. And so, if you haven't joined us before, what we typically do is I will present at the beginning, and I'm presenting more on the garden side, and then Elizabeth will present more on the utilization, preservation, and demo side. So, we're going to follow that pattern tonight. And I was fearful that it might be redundant if I did exactly what I'd done in some of the previous classes in this series. If you haven't joined us, what we did is I would pull out some examples of some of the things that she would be using in some of her demonstration and recipes, and I'd tell you how to grow those. I was afraid this week it'd be a little redundant, so I thought I'd take a little bit different tact with it this week. So certainly if you're looking more for growing information specifically, look at some of our earlier videos or some of the videos I've done earlier this year, specifically for vegetable gardening. You can find those on our YouTube channel. And so those may be of interest to you. But I thought what might be useful tonight is just touch some on pest control in the vegetable garden. And so you've seen this disclaimer before. Elizabeth spoke to it. Certainly, there is the potential to see some brand names. I may even mention some as we go through this. Just understand that those are for clarity and not for endorsement. If we're talking about pest control, there's a concept that's good to know about, but we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on it this evening, and that is integrated pest management, or IPM. I actually pulled the language you see on your screen from EPA. Don't worry, I'm not going to read that, and I don't necessarily think you need to read it as well. But what it is conceptually, integrated pest management is an approach to controlling pests where you're utilizing a multitude of different strategies. You're looking at some of the biological realities of the pest species as well as the crop or the garden item you're looking at. You want to utilize methods that have the least potential for hazard, whether it be to the environment, to individuals, and basically it allows us to make decisions on controlling the best that have the best interests of everyone at heart. And so it's not a program that says we will not use pesticides, for instance, but it says that when we use pesticides, we'll use the proper ones and in the proper manner to make sure that one, our goals are reached, the pest is controlled, but also that the environment as well as individuals are protected. So IPM doesn't mean we eliminate the use of chemical pesticides, for instance, but it does mean we evaluate what other potential options are there available to us to use. Particularly in the garden, to relate this to everybody this evening, there are some things we can do that would fall under integrated pest management that are great strategies to implement. So right off the bat, crop rotation. If you're not familiar with crop rotation, it's very straightforward. All it is that plants that are related to each other, plants that are in the same family, are not planted in the same spot in the garden year after year after year. And so what that means is a lot of folks will focus a lot on tomatoes and peppers. And so tomatoes and peppers are actually both related to one another. They're in the same plant family. And so even though you may plant tomatoes there this year and next year plant peppers, it's like you planted tomatoes twice. And so you're repeating a plant family. So what we want to do is alternate that. And there'll be a slide later on that shows some different plant families so you can get an idea of some rotations that might be possible in your garden. The reason we want to rotate is because plants that are in the same family share the same pest. So if we grow the same family in the same spot, what we do is we build up the level of diseases as well as insects. And so by rotating those or physically moving their location in the garden, we are actually reducing the likelihood of seeing repeat pest problems. That doesn't mean if we rotate, we'll see no problems, but certainly if we don't rotate, we do see an increase in problems. We also want to keep in mind that plants themselves want to resist pests, again, whether insects or diseases. And so we want to do everything we can to keep those plants healthy and really happy. And so there's several different ways we can do that. One of those is planting things at the proper time. And certainly we know in Tennessee, we're lucky to almost have really kind of three garden seasons when we look at the vegetable garden. We have an early cool season crops that we can plant out sometimes very early, such as peas in the garden, as well as, the brassicas, such as broccoli and cabbage and things like that. Then we kind of have the main warm season garden where we see a lot of favorites like beans, tomatoes, and peppers. And then we can actually do a second fall garden when we get towards the latter half of summer and extending into fall, where we can do a mixture of both some of our warm season as well as our cool season crops. So certainly if we try to take peas, for instance, and plant them out right now, they might get started okay, but as we get the warm temperatures of summer, you're going to have problems. So proper planting time is important. In the resources that you'll get and follow up to this evening's webinar, you will find some planting guides from University of Tennessee that will help you figure out good planting times for those crops. We also want to consider proper fertility. So if you've never done a soil test in your garden, it might be a good idea to do one. For most homeowners, typically we wouldn't advise you get one more frequently than every 3 to 5 years. That is often enough to allow for you to see any changes over time, but not so much that it becomes a burden. So certainly a soil test can help us with get a better picture of fertility and particularly pH, which affects nutrient availability within the soil. But definitely there are some rules of thumbs we can use when it comes to fertility and absence of a soil test. One thing that's important to note, a lot of our plants are going to prefer to have a side dress application of fertilizer in the season. Side dressing is where we come back after the plants are growing and we apply a fertilizer. Typically it's nitrogen because we don't want to apply all the nitrogen in the beginning of the season pre-plant because it will move on us. We can lose it, whether it's through um, leaching into the ground or runoff. And so we'll do split applications and do some later as a side dressing. So certainly take that into account. And a big one that's great for helping have the healthiest plants possible is irrigation. I always encourage folks whenever they're considering their vegetable garden, place it where you'd be able to get water to it easily because almost every year in Tennessee, during some point, there's going to be a period where your garden is going to be better if you have the ability to irrigate it. And so certainly there are some seasons wetter and drier than others, but almost always irrigation is going to be a big plus. And then also when we talk about integrated pest management, because it's not just about, which pesticide do I use, there's a lot of non-chemical tactics we can include in the garden. So some of this is planting time. So sometimes planting early as possible for as appropriate for a plant can help avoid peak pest populations in the garden. So that's one strategy that we can do. One that's very important, and that's why it's bolded on your screen, is sanitation of crop debris. And literally that just means getting the crop residues, those leftover plants after you're done harvesting, out of the garden. You can certainly till those under, and where you have raised bed or maybe where you had a lot of disease, it's actually better just to pull those out of the garden and throw them away. You'll note I didn't say to compost those, particularly if you have diseases in your plants. A compost pile may not reach a high enough temperature to kill those diseases. So if you know you have diseased plants, I would encourage you not to compost those, but actually to put those in the trash. Certainly, if it's just debris, you can compost it, but just be aware of the concerns of any plant debris that may be infested with diseases. One method that a lot of folks will use in the garden is physical exclusion of pests. Specifically, I'm thinking of using floating row covers on young plants or small plants to exclude uh, different sort of insect pests. And so these work well for certain things like greens, but also a lot of young plants. The one caveat to using row covers is that if it's a plant that needs to be pollinated in order for there to be fruit, then you will have to remove those at some point whenever they begin flowering. So certainly a lot of our cucumbers and melons and things like that can be started off well with the floating row cover, but as they reach the flowering stage, you would want to remove that. A great tactic to help control diseases is to look at resistant varieties. And so these are varieties that are bred specifically to have different mechanisms of resistance against diseases. There's a lot of options out there, more and more. Some breeding work is looking at taking some of the more heirloom qualities that a lot of people like in the home garden and also bringing into some of the more resistant uh, elements to those plants. So you see things that look kind of like the old fashioned heirloom varieties, often have a similar taste, but also have that disease resistance package. So certainly something worth looking at. And certainly often you see recommended is planting, flowers or other plants that would be nectar sources or a physical refuge for beneficial insects. I put an asterisk on this. And the reason I did that is if you look at some of the research, this is not necessarily just where if you plant flowers, the only possible thing to happen is you have beneficial insects. It's great to have these plantings out there because it does, for instance, provide nectar to the adult forms of parasitoid wasps, for instance. And so it is useful to have, but it's a complex relationship, and I don't want to overstate the benefit of it because certainly if we can have beneficials in those areas, we can also have pest insects in those areas. So just understand it's part of a larger landscape. And so I don't want to oversell it as being the cure all. But certainly chemical control. I do want to mention a few things briefly. The resource list will have some great links for you to follow and learn more options and everything you need, such as rates for use. The big one that we always mention when we talk about pesticide use is read and follow all label directions, because the phrase, the label is the law, is something you'll hear Extension mention often, and it's quite literal. The label is a law that says how and when a product can be used. Even organic pesticides have labels and they have to be followed. So make sure that you do follow that label. And when in doubt, go always with what it says, regardless of what I might say in a talk like this or what you might see elsewhere on the internet. We also want to be actively protecting our beneficial insects, such as pollinators. So when we do have to use products that can have negative effects on those, we want to use them in a way that prevents interaction. So for instance, very often you will find the recommendation in labels that you actually apply insecticides around dusk, late in the evening. You do that because most pollinators are not actively flying then. They've already stopped their activities for the day. So you're less likely to have direct contact with the insect that are pollinating or beneficial. And also in the instance of like our cucurbit crops, so cucumbers, melons, and that sorts of things, those flowers are only open for one day. They open in the morning and they close at night. And so by spraying at dusk, the flowers that open tomorrow won't have insecticide on them. So it's a great way to protect our pollinators, especially in a crop that we need them to be pollinating. And certainly in these resources, there are some effective organic control options. Sometimes there are not good options. And so just understand that If organic product use is something you're interested in, there are some resources for that. A big thing we always want to do whenever we look at selecting pesticides is number one, figure out what the pest is. An excellent product that controls caterpillars may not do a thing to a beetle. And so we need to understand what the pest at hand is and how we would go about doing that. We want to make sure that we use the correct rate. So labels will have correct rates depending on the insect that is being targeted, for instance, or disease in the case of something like a fungicide, as well as the crop that it's being applied to or the plant it's being applied to. Make sure you take that into account and don't assume the rate that you used previously is correct for the situation at hand. And certainly, again, where the label is the law, we are using those products according to that label, which will tell us for what pest, what plant, or site. Sometimes we'll have more general site mentioning, such as ornamentals, rather than individual specific species or plants. And always, we're directed where proper protective equipment. Or because we are dealing with chemical products, even organic products can pose a hazard to you. So certainly if it indicates utilizing gloves or eyewear, particularly during mixing, because that's when any of these products are at their most concentrated form and therefore the greatest risks to us as individuals, make sure you're utilizing proper protective equipment. One thing to take into consideration is rotating the mode of action of pesticides. What we mean by mode of action is how they work. So different insecticides act in different methods. Some of them may interfere with how a pest actually grows or develops from an egg to a to a larva to a pupa to an adult. And so some of those are actually interfering with that process. Others may directly be lethal to an insect. And so by changing modes of action, you prevent the development of a resistance. So if you're only using one, for instance, insecticide year after year after year, it may be useful to change from season to season from one to another, simply because by changing that mode of action, you can prevent those insects becoming resistant to them. And resistance is where a product no longer has the desired outcome or the desired control. Often useful for home gardens simply because of the scale is to use products that are already pre-mixed. They're ready to use. And so that way you just use what's needed and then it can go back into storage. One of the challenges when you are mixing your products up on demand, sometimes you may have too much product mixed, and then there's a question of where to dispose of it. Always the best application area is a labeled site. So we don't want to be pouring these things, down storm drains or anything like that. So very often ready to use or an easier give us the easier ability of using only what we need without having to dispose of the remainder. One thing that's important, and it goes back to what we mentioned earlier about identifying the pest, is scouting. And scouting is just basically looking at your plants, but you're doing it with the purpose of looking for insects or disease or anything that may be amiss. And so, one thing that I want to encourage you, especially when we're talking about insects, is look on the underside of leaves. Very few insects will stay perched on top of a leaf for long where they're easy to see because keep in mind there's other insects that eat them. There's predators like birds. And so typically they're on the underside of leaves. And very often we can find their eggs as well as feeding damage on that underside. It may not be apparent from above. So flipping over leaves, looking inside leaf whorls, if we have, leaves that are growing together, is always important to make sure we're actually having a good chance of finding them and learn to identify the different life stages. And there's some resources included on the list that will help you do that. So while it's great to understand when you have an adult present, if you can identify the larvae or the eggs of a pest, it's also important because that can actually give you a little bit of lead time before you have a hatching event that greatly increases the population. And sometimes, but not always, damage is identifiable or at least indicative of a certain pest. And so it's not always the truth, but there are some pests that damage plants in a slightly unique way, and at least it narrows the list of candidates. I mentioned earlier, here is an image from one of the resources on crop rotations, and you can see the different families of plants out there. What's really good is if you like sweet corn is in the grass family, and we basically don't have another vegetable that we commonly grow in the grass family. So it really is a great tool to utilize in rotations because it can follow anything. And so certainly this is something you may want to consider as you look at growing next year's garden. It's also why I encourage folks to have a written plan of this year's garden. That way you can remember what you had where, and so next year you can make rotation and not have to guess where something was. I mentioned resources. This is just a couple, and the next couple of slides will actually show some examples from these really good resources. I think you'll find them useful. The first one I'll just mention is the Home Vegetable Garden Disease Control, and here is a table from out of it, and there's also written parts of it, articles, so to say, that helps you understand some concepts about disease control in the garden. But here you see where there's the crop listed, uh, the disease that may be present, what it can look like, and then also some control options. And you will see it's not only saying, a pesticide product, but also cultural practices or things like that that can help you either prevent or control that pest. So very useful. The next one, don't love the name on it, I'll have to admit, but since they didn't ask me, I don't think they're too worried. But it's Conventional and Organic Product Overview for Home Vegetable Gardeners in Tennessee. So what this does is this actually lists different pest control products as well as fertility inputs or fertilizers that are useful in the garden. And so as you can see here on the table, this specifically is out of the insect section. There's also disease as well as that fertility section, and it lists the active ingredient. So very often in extension publications, you won't see necessarily a trade name, which is the second column. This actually has both. So the active ingredient is actually the ingredient in the product that has the effect on the target pest. And then a trade name is kind of like the brand name. And so very often when you see extension publications, they will mention the active ingredient, and then you can find it in any number of different products out in the stores. And so it's important to understand what the active ingredient is and how to look for that on the shelf. And you can see it talks about what pests these products control, as well as some different comments on their use. And so this can kind of help you give you a good idea of selecting products. Uh, the last one I'll mention briefly is just the You Can Control Garden Insects. And sure enough, it's focused on insect control. And we see a similar layout where, again, we have a crop and then specific pest, and then as well as some insecticide formulations, rates associated with that. And of course, this is based off a label review. Always review the label of your product and confirm, for instance, that the concentration of the active ingredient is the same. So again, this is just a reference point. Always follow your own label. And then as well as the last application and harvest period. So we call this pre-harvest interval in the commercial world. And what it literally means is how close to harvest can you apply this product? And so for instance, for the first product, you see it's 1 day. For the second, you see 3 days. And then there are other remarks or precautions there. Sometimes you'll see some products are actually limited on how many times it can be applied to a crop within a season. So definitely some good information there. But again, always consult your label. So just for a example, Mexican bead beetle, as the name would clue you in, is a pest on beans. What's important to understand is certainly you may be familiar with the adult here in the left, but you also want to be learning what do the eggs look like, because before you see the adult, you may find the eggs present. So that gives you an idea that there may be need for control. And almost without, and in fact, I would say without exception, young insects, small insects, are easier to kill than adults. And so certainly if you can find your pest problem when it's in the egg stage, you will actually have better control than if you're only looking for adults. And here we have the intermediate or pupa stage, or larva stage before it pupates. And so certainly understanding these different identifiable forms of an insect is a good practice. Bean beetles are also one that do have some distinctive damage. So these are not bean beetles. Some of you may be catching that. This is actually Japanese beetle on beans, another pest and another leaf feeder, a damaging leaf feeder. But there is a difference. One, you will see these beetles are on top of the leaf. Again, I said not a lot are, but you will find some insects on top of the leaf. So that's one thing that tells us just quickly it's probably not a Mexican bean beetle, but also the damage. We see big, large holes. With the Mexican bean beetle, you see a little more laciness to the leaf, and actually the damage is from the underside. And actually, with the larva stage, it's very lacy. You can see they're just eating the underside of the leaf and actually leaving the top intact. Sort of window painting is the reference. And so, certainly, the lower right damage is certainly not what we would associate with Japanese beetles, for instance. So, sometimes, again, that damage can be indicative of a pest. This is a scenario you may see out in your garden. This is a tomato hornworm. It's probably tobacco hornworm in this picture because of the source of the actual picture. However, it's the same insect. And so what you see there is a caterpillar with a bunch of little things attached to it. Those little things are actually cocoons of a parasitic wasp. So the wasp actually laid eggs in the caterpillar, and now those larvae are pupating and they will emerge as wasps themselves. You might imagine this does kill the caterpillar, but it also provides now a whole little army of wasps that are going to go and seek out other caterpillars. So if you see a caterpillar in your garden that has these cocoons attached to it, leave it. Don't kill it because it's actually a form of natural pest control. You're going to see parasitic wasps emerge from this eventually, and when they do, you now have more beneficials on your side. Of course, a lot of us are familiar with praying mantis, as we commonly call it, or mantids. There's actually three varieties that we have in Tennessee: the Carolina, the European, and the Chinese. The Carolina is actually the only native one, and it's actually smaller than the others. It only reaches about 2 inches in size. So just be aware of that good guy out in the garden. Lady beetles are one that I think is a good example of there can be a lot of diversity in the shape and even color. So certainly the multicolored Asian lady beetle that we see here in the upper left has a diverse range of color. There's also the seven spotted, that's kind of the classical representation we see often in books and things like that. But then we also have the spotted lady beetle. It's actually pink and black, not the typical colors we might expect to see, and its shape is different. It's more elongated. So just understand that that too is also a beneficial predator for us. And it's also important to understand the other forms that we may find of this beneficial in the garden. So newly hatched ladybird or lady beetle larvae don't necessarily look like their adult counterparts. And certainly as the larvae grow, they can have a unique look to them. These are very predatory on things like aphids, great to have in the garden, but you wouldn't want to mistake these for something like a caterpillar that's harmful. So make sure you can recognize those beneficials in different forms. And the pupa, the stage between larva and adult, is depicted with these two pictures on the right. And again, could look like something harmful, but in fact, it's a beneficial. And lastly, don't forget your pollinators. Always, whenever possible, restrict any pesticide applications to areas where pollinators are not. So if you have flowering plants and you don't need to apply an insecticide, that's a good thing. And certainly refuge and strips like that can be beneficial to them. So if you like having flowers mixed into the vegetable garden, I encourage you to do it. It is a useful practice and it can provide some benefits to our pollinators. So there is my contact info, and you'll also get that later on in the resources. And certainly feel free to ask any questions that you have of me or follow up later. And I will go ahead and stop my share.
Hi, Adam. So we have a few questions in the chat box.
Okay.
One of them is I have an infestation of white flies. I use neem oil, but is there something to do a better job? I know they go dormant in the winter. Last year, Evelyn took out soil and added new. It seems to be bad on tomato plants.
Okay. So yeah, white flies, there'd be a few different products possible that you could use. That'd probably be one I'd want to follow up with you. So if you want to either call me or email me, follow up with me, I can figure out, for instance, want to make sure that we are outdoors and not indoors, something like that, because there would be a little bit of different approach to it. But there would be some products that can control white flies, so I can help you with that.
Okay. The second question is, will there be any potential silver lining to the pending locust swarm? Do they eat any garden pests?
Okay. Well, they're not locusts, just to be nitpicky. They are actual cicadas. And the reason I say that, locust is actually a different insect. So grasshoppers, what we call grasshoppers, are actually a type of locust. So when people talk about swarms of locusts, it is not the periodical cicada that will soon be visiting upon us. Honestly, I thought we might start seeing them already before now. It's all dependent on soil temperature, and apparently our soils are staying a little bit cooler with some of our up and down weather we had. The short answer is no, there's not really any real benefit except for things that eat cicadas. So there's cicada killer wasps that are a very large, very frightening looking wasp that we may see hovering around our lawns. They don't really attack folks, they don't bother anybody. So it's a benefit to them and other things that eat cicadas, but it's not really beneficial. Now, when those cicadas die, because after they do their egg laying and everything, like a lot of insects, they die. So those bodies will decompose, and so it is a cycling of nutrients in the environment. But there's not a specific service that they provide in the environment per se, so there isn't anything like that that would be beneficial.
Another question is, I work in a large garden with schools. They put down cardboard and plastic over. Last year we had a bad infiltration of a brown fire ant. They are back this year. What should we do before preparing the soil?
Okay. The one question I would have is, where are you at? Because, like in our immediate vicinity in Washington County, we haven't yet found fire ants. So they may be another species. And why that's important, some of the products that we would recommend for you to use on other ants absolutely will not work with fire ants. And so the identity on that is going to be very key. There are some different products you can use out there for ant control. And so I think one, making sure we get a good diagnosis on exactly what species of ant we're dealing with is the first step in that one, because it will change what product we might recommend. And so I think there are some options that will be viable in that scenario, but we need to make sure. So if you're not in Washington County, I'd encourage you to reach out to your local county office and have them help you do that diagnosis. If they're not comfortable doing it in the office, they can certainly send it to UT for further analysis and make sure they get that spot on for you.
All right, so that's all the questions for now. I'll transition into my presentation, and then there'll also be an opportunity to ask Adam some more questions as I move from my kitchen, which we're kind of halfway there already. But what I'm going to share with you all is just a couple of handouts, and I don't particularly have a PowerPoint for you all this evening. And so a couple of the handouts that you'll receive as a follow-up email. The first one will be creating your own vegetable stir fry. So these are some of the common vegetables that you are going to find to put into your stir fry. And this evening, we're actually going to be using onion, broccoli, carrots. We're going to be using bell peppers, mushrooms, and I'm trying to think of, and jalapenos actually. And so we're also going to create our own sauce. It's a very simple 3-ingredient sauce. And then you can choose the grain that you like to put on, or that you like to put your stir fry on. Most people will do some form of rice for their stir fry. So some tips about stir frying. You just want to make sure with stir frying, it's a very quick process. It's, typically less than 5 minutes to cook this. So when you do stir fry, you want to make sure that you have everything prepared before you even get started. So you've got to make sure that all your vegetables are cut up. Your meat is cut up if you're going to use meat in it. All of that is prepared before you actually turn the heat on for the oil in the pan. This is because it's a very quick moving, very fast paced type of cooking method. And so you don't want anything to burn at the bottom of your pan. So it's also important to choose the right vessel. So you do want to use, if you have a wok, if you have availability of a wok, that's the ideal one to use. But you can also use a larger skillet that has deep sides. So this way because as you start putting things into your pan, they just start getting bigger. They start piling in, and you don't realize actually how much you have to. You want to make sure that you're cooking over medium to high heat, so kind of towards the highest setting if at all possible. And you want to make sure that you heat up your oil just before it starts to smoke. It's also good to cook this in smaller batches if you can. So you don't want to overfill your pan with too much vegetables. And then also you want to make sure that you remove any excess moisture from your vegetables before you actually put it in the skillet. And if you do put meat, whether it's chicken or tofu, you want to make sure that it's dry before you actually add it into the skillet. Some other tips that might be handy. So if you are using unthawed meat, you actually want to put it in the freezer for about 15 minutes before you slice it up. So this will actually make it easier to slice. And you want to slice across the grain to shorten long, tough muscle fibers, and they become easier to chew. And the tofu, you want to make sure that you use extra firm tofu. And then there is ways to make sure that you drain the tofu properly. And the thing with tofu is that it takes over the flavors of whatever sauce that you're putting in there, other flavors from the dish. And of course, like I was saying, make sure that you wash your vegetables ahead of time and making sure that your food is cut uniform. So I'm going to stop my share. And I'm going to move over to my kitchen area really quick so I can show you all just quick method to stir frying. And if you've got any questions for Adam, this is a good opportunity to ask those in the chat box. Let's start my video.
I will just mention briefly again, I think I said it when I was presenting, if you're looking for more specific, like how to grow information, there are several recorded webinars from earlier this year that speak to growing vegetables. You may want to review some of those. Honestly, the format we do here, whenever we do this where we split the time, the best I do is introduce things to folks. And so probably you would want to follow up with that anyway, even if I didn't focus on pest control with this session. But certainly if you have questions on any specific vegetables that you'd like to put out in the garden, feel free to follow up with me. My phone number, the office number is there in the chat. You're welcome to email me, watson@utk.edu. Whatever works best for you, and certainly be happy to follow up with you on that.
All right, thank you, Adam. So hopefully you all can see this. I pinned it so that everybody can see. So one thing that a lot of people do add to their stir fry is mushrooms. And so these are just white mushrooms here. And usually when you get them, you have to clean them. And so the best way, and I've already kind of cleaned these, is to put, just have a bowl of cold water, fresh cold water, put your mushrooms in there and just kind of bob them up and down, and it will remove any of the dirt that might be on the mushrooms. And like I said, I've already kind of cleaned these beforehand, but so the water's not all gonna get all that dirty, okay? So once you do that, then we are actually going to remove them. And I have a little towel thing over here that I place it on. And then I will take some paper towels. You can take a cotton dish rag, and you can do it also this way, but you just dry them. You just pat it down to dry your mushrooms. Now, with mushrooms, they are ones, like if you do purchase them in store, if you do purchase them from the farmer's market, you want to make sure that you store them in a paper bag before you put them into the refrigerator. This allows them to breathe, and so they don't mold as fast. But of course, mushrooms are very delicate, and they don't last as long as a lot of the other vegetables that you use. Now, with stir fry, and I kept a couple of pieces of bell pepper to demo this to you all, but I've already cut up most of my bell pepper here. And you'll notice, like if you go to a lot of restaurants, you'll notice that they're kind of cut in triangles, and they're cut to be like bite-sized, so they're easy to chew. Sometimes most people will leave them these long cuts here, and you can leave them that way too, but a lot of people like them this way, the bite size. But when you cut, you want to cut at an angle so that you're making a triangle with this, okay? And so you just kind of go back and forth to make those triangles. Now, when you do stir fry, you want to make sure that all the pieces of the vegetables, no matter what vegetable you're putting in here, they are very similar sizes to the rest of the vegetables. So you can see I'm sitting here and I'm cutting them at an angle. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put them over here. All right. So the next thing that people find fun is putting onion in there. So I'm going to show you all how to cut an onion. And so you saw that here is the root ends, okay? And this is the blossom end. So I'm cutting off the blossom end. And then I'm actually going to cut it in half where I have the root end cut in half, okay, and holds this together. Now we're going to peel off. It is probably going to sound like I have a cold, but I'm blocking my nose from taking in the scent of the onion. So we're going to peel off the first layer of our onion here, okay? And so with our onion, you see that there's multiple layers. Now when we cut this, normally when most people will cut this, you'll cut it down the vein. So you'll cut about 3/4 of the way. So you'll start here and you'll cut down. So I'll show that to you real quick. And you're going to follow kind of the lines on the onion itself. All right. So when I open this up, it creates like a little fan, okay? But it's still connected, all right? So this is the easiest way to cut an onion. Now, if I had a big fat one, so this side is bigger, I'd cut it down the center here, and then I would make my cuts that way. Now this way, I make my cuts, and you have your perfectly diced onion here. Okay, so those are the size, that's about the size that most people like. Of course, if you want it minced, then you cut it even more than that. So for this one, like I said, since it's a little bit fatter piece, I cut down the center. I don't cut all the way here, okay? And then I make my cuts about 3/4 of the way. Right. And I start slicing. This is the easiest and the fastest way to cut up your onions. All right. So I'm going to set that to the side. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make my sauce. All right. So in here, you can do it in a bowl. You can do it in a canning jar. This is what I've got is my canning jar here. And I've got about 1/3 cup of low sodium soy sauce already put in here. Then I need a tablespoon of cornstarch. Okay. And so the cornstarch here is to actually help thicken the sauce when we put it in with our vegetables. So I'm going to shake this up, get it mixed in really well with that. Okay. So cornstarch, you don't add cornstarch directly. You add it to a little bit of a liquid, whether it is soy sauce, whether it is water or chicken broth. You can use chicken broth to make your own. Okay. So, and then actually what I'm going to use is I'm going to use some honey here. If I can get it open. All right. And so the easiest way to do honey to make sure that it doesn't stick, I'm going to rinse this off real quick, is actually to spray either your measuring cup, your measuring spoon with cooking spray. Just do one really quick shot of cooking spray and then measure out your honey. So when it goes inside, it's easier. It comes out a lot easier. It doesn't stick to the sides of it. Okay. So I'm putting about 2 tablespoons of honey into this. Now, if you're doing this in a bowl, you can actually just use a whisk to mix this up. Okay. Put that to the side. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to shake it up. Okay. So our sauce is ready. You can add more stuff to this. If you love garlic, you can add garlic to it. If you like a little heat, you can add some red pepper to it. So you can kind of make it your own. But this is the base of the stir fry sauce, okay? So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna turn on my burner here, and I'm gonna turn it to a high heat, all right? And then I'm gonna add about 3 tablespoons, 2 to 3 tablespoons of oil, okay? So if you like more of an Asian flavor, a lot of people will use sesame oil for this, okay? So here I have a wok. So I'm gonna move the oil around a little bit. Now, if you happen to not have a wok, I'll pull out my other pan here, you can use one of these skillets. So this is the next largest skillet that I have. And you see that it has deeper sides on it. But I'm gonna get my oil pretty hot. So what I have here is I've got some onion, so I'll cook onion. I've got bell peppers. I got snow peas here. I've got mushrooms. I've got carrots and broccoli. And so typically, and I've also got some garlic over here too. Now, when you stir fry, you always start with the most hardiest vegetable. So what that means is it takes a little bit longer to cook. So think of the real crunchy type of vegetables that you have to really chew into to get it, okay? So we're heating up our oil, we're getting that going. And what I might actually do is add our garlic to this, you know? So if you're a garlic fan, this is a great opportunity to add as much garlic as you like. So I'm a huge garlic fan. All right, so we got it. Now your garlic, you don't want to cook it till it's burnt. So it's just a golden color. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add my broccoli in here. This is the next hardiest one, the one that's going to be harder, takes a little bit longer to cook. Now, I was reading somewhere and saw somewhere that some Asian restaurants actually will blanch their vegetables before they cook them, before they stir fry them. So there, I know there's a kind of a glare. Let me see if I can turn that off so you, I can't see that either. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in my onion. Okay. Now the whole point of the blanching part of it, if you choose to do that, is if you're one that is not a huge fan of very crunchy vegetables, but you don't like mushy vegetables either, that blanching process helps soften those vegetables so that they're easier to chew. Okay. And you start off with like your carrots and your broccoli first, okay? And then you blanch those for about 5 minutes, and you do this all in one pot. And then you add like your peppers. So we got some bell peppers here, the different colorful ones, okay? Adding those into there. Okay. So we got this going pretty good. Hopefully y'all can kind of see that. Okay. Now, as the cooking goes, you'll see that it starts bringing out some of those other colors. It's a more brighter color. I'm going to add in some snow peas here. Okay. Get those mixed up. And then I will also add in about the same time your mushrooms, because your mushrooms don't take very long to cook. Now, mushrooms are also one that you want to make sure, say that you find a whole bunch of mushrooms that you really like, so mushrooms don't last very long. They typically mold, is you actually saute them, okay? And then you're able to freeze your sauteed mushrooms for about a month in the freezer. So you can pull them out as needed. It's a very colorful looking dish right now. Okay. Lost some of my snow peas. You can also use sugar snap peas. You're a sugar snap pea fan. Okay. And you can see why you need like a deep pan, because you see they like to hop out. Because you constantly have to be stirring this. Okay. You can't just let it sit. You have to keep stirring it. Okay. And then we can add in our sauce. So our mushrooms are cooking really well. They're getting a darker color. They're not that off-white. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to shake this up, and I'm going to add in our sauce here. Okay. And so this is just that stir fry sauce, and it'll help thicken it up. And then you go ahead and you serve it on your favorite grain. So whether it's white rice or brown rice, jasmine rice, quinoa is also a good one. Quinoa gives you a lot of more protein. Okay. So I'll show this to you all. You can kind of see it. You can see it sizzling, or hear it sizzling. And that's your stir fry. So that's probably less than 5 minutes that we were able to do that. Okay. So I'm gonna let that sit here. Now, if you're one that loves the heat, okay, I'm letting that sit so I can let the sauce kind kind of heat up or set, sorry, you can add jalapenos to this. Now, if you watched my other video, I think it was our first video that we had, and then also you'll see me do this in our salsa one too. Anytime you are messing with hot peppers, you will always put gloves on, okay? Or if you forget and you don't have any gloves on and you start touching your face afterwards, it's not going to be fun at all. Okay, you're going to be hurting. So we're going to cut off the tops and the bottoms. Okay, and then we're just going to go ahead, and I've already washed all these vegetables. So if you're wondering that, I've done that. Okay. So, and then we're going to go ahead, and you can either take out these portions that have the seeds and the innards. I'm turn my heat back on, and I'm just going to throw my jalapeno peppers on there, and I'm taking out the membrane and the seeds from it. Okay.
Elizabeth, we have a
Yes.
question I thought it might be worth asking now. If you wanted to add chicken, for instance, at what step would you do that?
So your chicken, you actually want to cook your chicken first. Okay, so when we heat up our oil, at that point, that's when you add your chicken. Okay, you cook up your chicken, and then you actually take your chicken out. Okay, and then you just do the process that we just did here with your vegetables, and then you would add your chicken back in towards the later end, and you cook it back up again, making sure that you cook your chicken to at least 165 degrees Fahrenheit, the internal temperature of it. Okay. A lot of people want to go by the color. That's probably not the best option because meat does change colors as it ages. Okay. So let me pause my video here as I move back over to my little area. Now, is there any other questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was one other question in the chat. It says that you mentioned using vegetable oil. Can you use other oils as alternatives, such as canola or peanut oil?
Yes, you can use other oils. I did use a canola oil for mine because I didn't have any sesame oil. Like I said, you can use sesame oil, but it's a little bit more expensive. But if you have vegetable oil on hand, go ahead and use that. Olive oil, you want to make sure that it says olive oil. It's not extra virgin olive oil, because there are differences when it comes to olive oil. So extra virgin olive oil is more for tasting. So if you plan on using it in like a salad dressing, that's when you want to use it. The extra or the regular olive oil, that's more for cooking type of instances. So the olive oil has a higher flash point than extra virgin olive oil. And when I say flash point, that means that it doesn't catch on fire as quickly. So you want to have, a higher flash point. Sesame oil, let's see. So I've been asked if sesame oil burns easily. I don't know that answer right offhand. I've used it before, but really with any oil, you want to be mindful. You want to make sure that if you start seeing it smoke, that's the point that you need to take it off of the burner because it is about to catch fire. So somebody asked about shrimp. Yeah, so any kind of meat, you want to cook that first. Take it off or take it out of the pan, do your vegetables, and then add your meat back in to that. Any other questions? All right. So just to kind of wrap us up for the evening, of course, my contact information is the same as Adam's. You can call our office at 423-753-1680. If you have a gardening question, Adam's the one to talk to. If you've got a cooking question or a nutrition question, I am the one to ask. And so we have really good admins that can filter calls really well for us. But I'm sure if you ask for either one of us and we can't answer, we'll get you in contact with the other. This is also, of course, my email address. Our website is washington.tennessee.edu. And then, of course, our Facebook and YouTube channels. You want to visit those. We will be posting this video here after the class, probably later this week. I did go in and I posted the last 2 classes that we had. And then also you will get a follow-up email from me that will have the resources from this evening. And then also a link to a survey that will take less than 2 minutes to complete for us. But you can also visit that here right now at stirfrygardensurvey.questionpro.com. And we really appreciate that. And it gives you an opportunity to let us know if there's any other programs that you'd like to see offered through UT Extension. And then finally, just a little plug for our last class of the season for the Garden to Table series is the salsa garden. So I'm really excited about this one because I get to show you all traditionally what salsa is like from New Mexico, because that's where I grew up. But I will be showing you how to prepare salsa, fresh salsa, to use. You can register at tiny.utk.edu/salsa garden. And it will be 2 weeks from tonight at 6:30 p.m. And all right.